Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to speak today in this beautiful place. I had already the pleasure to present a paper 3 years ago at the occasion of the one-day seminar on safeguarding the cultural heritage. I have very good memories of this meeting, and I thank the Iran Heritage Foundation for the today invitation. As everybody knows, Pasargadae was the capital and residence of Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BC. I dare to speak of this highly symbolic place because I have worked on that site for several seasons between 1999 and 2009 with an Iran-France joint team of archaeologists. When the project started, it was sponsored by the Iran Cultural Heritage Organization and has its first aim to prepare the project of inscription of Pasargadae on the UNESCO World Heritage List. For this purpose, the site had to be studied beyond the known and visible monument by the exploration of the huge empty space and to explore the site beyond the limit of the protected site. The fieldwork of the first four seasons contributed to the successful inscription of Pasargadae on the list of the UNESCO in 2004. Apart from that goal, there was a scientific program to better understand the functioning of the site, its history during and after the Achaemenid period. Pasargadae is a place name totally related to Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Achaemenid Empire. However, the site does not benefit of the same fame as Persepolis, which is only 50 kilometers southwards as the crow flies. Today, many tourist tours stay for a couple of hours in Persepolis and Rustam, but only a few of this group visit Pasargadae, unfortunately. Conversely, Pasargadae, or better to say the soul tomb of Cyrus, near the entrance of the site, attracts hundreds of thousands of Iranians because of the profound symbol it represents for the grandeur of Iran 2,500 years ago. Today, I would like to present Pasargadae beyond the Cyrus tomb and the visible monuments, stressing the importance of the invisible features still buried, spread over an environment which is far from natural, as we will see. Previous research and the current fieldwork on the whole Pasargadae area show Cyrus' activity was much more ambitious than suspected, and at the same time, more complicated than assumed during the formative period of the Achaemenid Empire of the mid-6th century BC. For starting, let me quote the historian Pierre Briand in his celebrated book, From Cyrus to Alexander, A History of the Persian Empire. I quote him. How can we explain this sudden outburst into history by a people and a state hitherto practically unknown? How can we explain not only that these people could forge military forces sufficient to achieve conquests as impressive as they were rapid, but also that, as early as the reign of Cyrus, it had available the technological and intellectual equipment that made the planning and building of Pasargadae possible? We can more precisely formulate the last question. How and when was Cyrus able to build his residence and to control the progress of the work, since he was more often than not away from Fars, very busy to conquer, securing his empire, organizing its management? Beyond this general question, there is another one. to which extent Cyrus, in a position to envision and execute the construction of Pasargadae, for which he selected several different traditions of the Near East and Greek Western Asia Minor, and was at the same time able to carefully integrate them within his project that counted many Iranian and or Persian features. For long, scholars assumed that Cyrus was the heir of a small kingdom in southwestern Iran, succeeding to a series of petty kings who were the neighbors of the last small new Elamite kingdom in southwest Iran, namely in Fars and Khuzestan, and later vassal of the Medes. In fact, Cyrus went revolt against Astyages, the king of the Medes, and was victorious in 553. He founded Pasargadae on the place of his victory. Now, to precise my question, how to build Pasargadae, being very often far from it, let us quickly consider Cyrus' activity in the year following his first victory over the Medes. Cyrus went to conquer Asia Minor, especially Croesus' Lydian kingdom, with its capital in Sardis. That consumed a lot of time, but by 545, Cyrus has vanquished over the Lydian kingdom, and he continued his conquest to the west by submitting Greek Ionian cities. The conquest of such distant and powerful kingdom and the Ionian cities, about 2,500 kilometers far from Pasargadae, required careful preparation for several months. After his victories, Cyrus had to remain in these areas for some period in order to organize the administration of this province. Cyrus eventually went back to Persia, but his presence was soon required in the east, I would say northern Iran today, to secure that part of his empire. Later on, Cyrus overtook Babylon. According to the Cyrus cylinder, Cyrus made a peaceful entry in Babylon in 539 before Christ, but we know that it was preceded by battles and negotiations, a period to be counted in terms of months. And after the conquest, the former Neo-Babylonian kingdom, today, later, Mesopotamia and Levant, had to be integrated to the new administration. Very likely, Cyrus stayed in Mesopotamia for a long period of time. The historian Xenophon states that Cyrus spent 7 months every year there because of the importance of that region. And finally, in these last years, Cyrus was not again in Pasargadae, but in Central Asia, where he, until his death in 530. To sum up, for 20 years, Cyrus would not have resided for any long period at Pasargadae. How the empire has been structured and organized during the first decades has not hitherto been addressed in a satisfactory manner, and we don't know who was in charge of helping the king for the administration of the empire. Therefore, for his residence in Pasargadae, also, Cyrus ought to have delegated the building of the city and its monument. The diversity of the monument in Pasargadae was supposed to have been influenced by the art and architecture of the conquered countries following the military and political events between 550 and 530, and particularly for Pasargadae, the conquest of the Lydian kingdom and the Greek Ionian cities. The Ionian, Greek, and Mesopotamian flavors in the architecture and in the image of the monument of Pasargadae are obvious but we should see them not as a passive influence, because the Persian king were for long supposed to have been without culture in their small and remote kingdom. These external flavors should be seen as conscious borrowing process from the varied cultures of the Near East, the past one, like Neo-Assyrian and Elamite components, or the contemporary components, like Lydian, Greek, and maybe Levantine features. This phenomenon has been called a positive eclecticism by the Swedish art historian and archaeologist Carl Nylander already 50 years ago. These words are perfectly accurate to express Cyrus' policy for its building in Pasargadae, and later on, and later for Darius' palaces in Persepolis. We'll see some example of this borrowing selected by Cyrus and his architects, but there is a paradigmatic case with the famous winged genius. This sculpture of the door jump of the gate, monumental gate of Pasargadae, exhibits some varied component, as I indicated, Assyrian for the double. Sorry. Back. This one. The double ale, Neo-Assyrian. The dress is Elamite from preceding kingdom in southwestern Iran, and the crown is Egyptian. Cyrus didn't conquer Egypt, but he saw some example of this Egyptian crown, probably in the today Palestine. Coming back to the beginning of Pasargadae, we should wonder why Cyrus selected this place, Pasargadae, precisely. In Fars, it would have been possible to find other suitable place, like Persepolis, for example. According to the Greek historian Strabo, Pasargadae was, as I said, the place where he vanquished the Medes. So Cyrus had to manage with that site and its environment, and particularly with a crucial issue, water resource. It happens that in that area, the Polvar River is deeply incised in the ground, more than 5 meters deep here. The ground level is here, and the river is there. So, setting the residence and its related features along the river would suppose a costly technique for elevating water. That was the first reason to settle away from the river and to dig a derivation canal from 3 kilometers upstream from Pasargadae and arriving on the site that way. You can see this canal. Moreover, there is another stream running to the west of the site here, and the two streams merge to the south of the site in the entrance of a gorge called Tangi Boulari. The other reason to settle there was the presence of several hills, about 30 meters high on this map, these hills. The highest of them bearing the platform called Talitart, for where Cyrus planned to have his palace. A view of this palace with a 19th century drawing by 2 French architects and painters, and the state today of the large platform, more than 100 meters long here, made of carefully cut stone. We'll see some example. Constructing Pasargadae, now to see the process. During his conquest, Cyrus, as I said, had the opportunity to observe the architecture and imagery used in diverse parts of his empire. So he collected techniques, iconographic elements, and decorative motifs which he wanted to implement in his homeland. These borrowed elements were selected to be transformed and integrated in a project that also included Persian components. This process from the original concept through its implementation with external and local elements was an ambitious and creative policy. The ultimate aim was probably to exhibit in his residence the diversity of his empire and the resources of his new empire, as Darius will do some decades later in Persepolis. The process is well illustrated by many examples that display elements borrowed from other cultural contexts, such as Greek techniques and elements. In palatial architecture, Assyrian-inspired iconography in the realization of the winged genius, as I said, but also on relief on the door jambs of the columned hall. One cannot reduce the architecture of Pasargadae to a series of borrowings. However, the Persian components created at that time are very important. The first example of Persian creation is the layout of the city, of the royal residence, and maybe the town. From which model Cyrus drew his inspiration for planning Pasargadae. As a matter of fact, the layout is still partly unknown, especially for the housing of the population, but the visible and detected components do not resemble to anything previously known in the Near East. The dispersed buildings leave more unbuilt areas in the plain. We'll see that these apparently empty spaces were not empty. For exploring the empty areas, I should mention that one of the main strategies we implemented in Pasargadae in the last 2 decades were geophysic methods. Since 1999, the joint project has used varied geophysical methods for detecting features still buried in the ground. These methods, and particularly the magnetic prospection with this device here, you can see, record the contrast between the magnetism of the general matrix, the soil, and the magnetism produced by stone or mud brick or baked bricks, or canals or ditch. From that, this is an example of the result of the magnetic prospection behind the famous tower Zindan-i-Soleiman, which is in plan here, and behind it, the magnetic prospection detected a completely unsuspected building here, which is about 40 by 40 meters, and probably built of stones, which was completely buried in this small elevation. So now another team of Iranian team started to excavate this building since 2015. Apart from this device, we also use radar for prospection and electromagnetic and diverse methods for detecting these buried structures. From the magnetic survey, one of the main results was to note definitely the total absence of a rampart in Pasargadae, neither a city wall nor an inner wall delimiting and protecting the royal quarters. And Herzfeld, the first excavator of Pasargadae in the 1920s, cautiously inferred of the existence of a rampart on the south side, here in the rectangle. But he already observed that this rampart was not connected to the gate itself. The gate is here, and here an aerial view of the gate. So, therefore, the space between the supposed rampart and the gate makes Pasargadae totally indefensible. Compared to the strongly walled cities of Babylonia and Assyria, Pasargadae offers a completely different pictures. To explain, you can see, especially in Babylon, the strong rampart on both sides of the Ishtar gate here. So the gate is really a protection for the city. To explain the absence of ramparts and the loose urbanism, Herzfeld, the first excavator of the site, supposed Pasargadae was a kind of campsite, having in mind the Persians were nomadic people in the previous decades before Pasargadae. That hypothesis cannot be longer maintained, neither for the history of the Persians nor for Pasargadae. Instead, we have to think more along the ways David Stronach, the British excavator of Pasargadae, envisaged the realization. It may prove possible to think in terms of a subtle and carefully conceived master plan. Moreover, we may assume that Cyrus felt the art of his empire, that the art of his empire was totally secure, or perhaps he wanted to demonstrate the peace of his Persian homeland without putting a rampart in his capital. This view is strengthened by the plan of the gate, which is without any defensive character. It's only a symbolic entrance to the royal quarter, an impressive isolated building with 4 large doors with the decorated door jambs. Definitely Pasargadae is the beginning of the prototype of the plan we can see later in Persepolis, the so-called all-nation or Xerxes Gate, and in Susa, the two, as in Pasargadae, with some hall, with a columned hall. Sorry. Some other example of mixed external components adapted by the Persian. The plan of the 2 palaces with a unique central hall and surrounded by porticos. You can see the palace, so-called audience hall with a series of columns. Like in the gate, monumental gate, the central columns are protected today by some walls, mud brick walls, because they are very decayed. And the same for the other palaces, so-called residential palaces, with a central columned hall and porticos. And this is another trait which is completely new in the Near East, is the use of capitals in 4 parts of animals instead of for the capital, instead of a capital like it is in the Greek architectures. And the poor remains in Pasargadae, which have disappeared since then. Only the drawing by Herzfeld survive, but you can compare them to the bull, horses, and griffin of Persepolis. Maybe more important in the history of architecture in the antiquity, Pasargadae offer the first example of stone columns. They transform the central space into a large columned hall, which contrasts with the narrow cella of the Greek temple, which the Greek architecture didn't use column in the hall. Therefore, the central room was always narrow, and with the column halls, the Persians were able to have large rooms. And the ancestor of these column halls here in stone, in Pasargadae, can be found in the so-called median site, such as Nushejan, excavated also by David Stronach in the late 60s and 70s, and the other site of Godin Tepe, excavated by a Canadian mission in the same period. And both sites date from the 8th and 7th century BC. To sum up, there is a strong influence of the Greek iron and stone masonry techniques. True, there is no tradition of such techniques in Fars and even in Iran. In the same way, the stone techniques are visible on the terrace. You can see some close-up with this carefully dressed stone here and there, in the corner of the terrace, here. And we even some later, some mason marks are very similar to the mason mark you can see in Ionian cities in Western Asia Minor. So by flattening this technique, flattening the edge of the blocks and carefully polishing for joining them without mortar, it's distinctive Greek techniques. The stone columns and their base are also from the West, but as we have seen, the implementation, the general shape of the column halls, the two colors of some column bases, and the animal forepart on the top as the capitals are neither from Mesopotamia nor from the Greek world, but a Persian creation. Widening our vision of Pasargadae beyond architectural details of importance, there are two other important issues. The geometric plan of the central part of Cyrus' capital, which is without earlier example. The Persian garden, the garden of Pasargadae, has attracted much attention since in its discoveries, step by step, since in the 1920s, but mainly with the work of Ali Sami and David Stronach in the 1960s. The layout of the central garden is underlined by stone watercourses. Here, you can see here. Designing a rectangle of 145 by 112 here. And this rectangle is within another wider rectangle, 200 meters by 160. Altogether, these water courses run 1,100 meters linear, enclosing 3.5 hectares. The channels are made of a series of monolithic U-shaped stone here, with every 14 meters a basin, square basin, deeper than the channels, probably for retaining water, and in my idea, to draw water in a bucket to water the plants and flowers around. The garden in the Near East has been known since long, but they were first linked with temples. Later, in the 2nd millennium BC, gardens were led by Assyrian kings primarily for their own pleasure. However, none of this representation of garden of the Neo-Assyrian relief can be compared with the geometrical design of the Pasargadae garden. The Assyrian garden are set on a hill, topped by a small pavilion, open pavilion here, from which rows of trees and small stream run down, but it's not the regularity of the Pasargadae garden. I should precise that we know the Assyrian garden only from bas-relief, not from the actual gardens. Conversely, the garden of Pasargadae is located in a flat area and shows a geometric design strongly defined by the stone channels. The stone buildings are not in the middle of the garden, but the buildings are around it. Therefore, the garden appears to be more important than the relatively modest hypostyle buildings. Once again, when we compare the respective importance of both elements, Pasargadae is definitely different from the Assyrian palaces, which are compacted buildings around courtyard. This is distinctive Mesopotamian palace, completely different from Pasargadae. Another very important component is also related with the landscaped central area of Pasargadae. The magnetic survey revealed from the derivation canal from the Pulvar that the derivation was transformed near the bridge into a huge trapezoidal pond of some 250 meters long and 50 to 100 meters wide. The depth is not very impressive, it's only 1.5 meters deep. Given the strong contrast of the geomagnetic map, the embankment seems to be made of dressed stone. So here you have the magnetic map, here the interpretation. And this shape, which is not a photo, this is a map, underlined by the blue line. This is the pond, 250 meters long here. Moreover, for maintaining a constant level in the pond, there is a series of water gates here and probably here. So the level of water could be maintained all over the year at the same level. No need to highlight in front of such an audience that the fourfold garden we have seen with the water course plus the large pool should be seen as the ancestor of the Persian garden, so well illustrated in later period, especially in the Safavid Persia. The geometric layout, the view with some reconstruction of colleague at documentary film producer and director, Fazil Rezayan. We produced this book on Pasargadae. John also knew it at that time, 5-6 years ago. The geometric layout of Pasargadae, designed by Cyrus, goes far beyond the central garden, and this is one of the new discoveries of the site. Days and days of magnetic survey carried on dozens of hectares around the garden have detected between the central garden and the tower Zendani Soleiman, which you have here, detected some lines, some magnetic anomalies, designing this square or rectangle between 30 and 60 meters long, which very likely correspond to ditches and small watercourse, or even some fence. So from this example on some 1-2 hectares here, this network of channels of ditch, we assume a large part of the plain of the whole flat area from the platform to the Cyrus tomb has been an immense landscaped park organized with rectilinear lines of ditches for irrigation. This is another reconstruction, our reconstruction of the site on the plan, the park paradise, and the reconstruction, an artist's view from Mr. Rezayan here. So with this 100 hectares in surface, this reminds us the term paradise, which is mentioned by the Greek authors, and Pasargadae would be the first example of the Persian paradise, the celebrated Persian invention. The extension of the park is highly possible, as I said, between the hill and the Cyrus tomb, which would be right here. And again, this is typically a Persian invention, neither former Neo-Assyrian garden was so regularly organized, nor the Greek or Egyptian garden, which were usually very small in comparison with 1 hectare garden. The central part of the site was totally featured and landscaped to stage the royal power and its capacities to master the natural environment, creating a sharp contrast between the arid, mountainous landscape and the flat and green park. Another example of, this is a general view also from the same book, giving an idea what it could have been. Another example of paradise has been recently discovered very far from Pasargadae in the Republic of Azerbaijan, dated to the 5th century BC, the site of Karachamirli, which is definitely Achaemenid, as shown by the bell-shaped column bases they found in the palaces. And you have the same system as in Pasargadae, a monumental gate here, you have a closer view here, and the central palace in the middle of a garden, 400 by 400 meters, plus other building, stone building here, there. So you have, and there again. So you have the same kind of loose urbanism as we have seen in Pasargadae, reproduced 2,000 kilometers far away from Pasargadae and 1 century later than Pasargadae. I cannot resist to show you also this view of Chel Sotun in 17th century pavilion in Isfahan, and especially for the pond in front, the basin in front of the pavilion, and also for the canal which runs around the pavilion, which is so similar to Pasargadae watercourse. In this picture of Pasargadae, an important component has not been mentioned until now, the city itself. I must say that despite our efforts, the city, or the town, remains totally the most enigmatic issue in Pasargadae. For a while, we suspected the town for the workers, artisans, and later for the population, and the inhabitants would be located beside the citadel in this area, in the red rectangle, where we proceed to a lot of magnetic prospection on more than a dozen of hectares. And we detected a series of long shaped figures of probably long barracks between 30 and 60 meters long around the courtyard. But such plan of long building remind us more military barracks or artisan barracks than housing for the common people. Moreover, the surface spots were very scarce, and we cannot be sure this is of the Achaemenid period. It could be later. So this issue is a major question for the future of the program. For not leaving this unsolved issue on a negative result, let me tell you a rather funny event. In 2017, in a cold December morning, it had snowed during the night. Going to the site, the archaeologists noted that the snow was unevenly covering the ground. Observing the soil more closely, my colleague saw that the snowy areas were drawing some straight lines. Suspecting the reality, they ran to launch the drone and were able to obtain air photos of the construction plan, able to see even every mud brick of the walls, as you can see here. Each small square corresponds to bricks which are completely buried, not visible on the surface in a normal weather. So the phenomenon was due to a differential melting of the snow that stayed longer on the cold area. Then the cold area corresponds to areas which cover stone or brick structures. So the archaeologists made pictures. They began to draw what they can see, but at 11 o'clock in the morning, it was over. The snow was completely melted. So now, for finishing, I'll come back to my main issue, water in Pasargadae. I would like to show some picture because of the recent field research, recent field research has revealed sophisticated hydraulic engineering much beyond the Pasargadae itself, up to some example of the use of water in Persia, later in the Middle Ages and Safavid period. As I showed, water was abundant in the center of the site, with the water running in the watercourses and the large basin with its regulated flow of water. But to feed the basin, I mentioned the diversion channel dug from the Pulva River, 3 kilometers upstream, and then running along the site. The problem is to have a constant water flow for the people's needs and for the irrigation of the garden. Well, I should go back here, as it is in the later garden. Most parts of Iran are in arid areas, and even in the mountainous parts, the climate is semi-arid with sharp contrast in water resources, depending on the season. Some rain from November to February, then snow melt in spring, which may provoke floods, and drop from July to late autumn, resulting in a serious shortage of water. What is very surprising is that since the foundation of Pasargadae, the problem of water and the regulation of this resource has been treated in a very sophisticated way. There remains of half a dozen of dams on the Pulvar River, up to 30 kilometers north of Pasargadae. Dating the dams to the Achaemenid period is highly likely, and it is certain for at least 2 dams. Very likely, this series of dams intended to control the water flow, retaining water in spring in huge natural reservoirs of millions of cubic meters, then providing a continuous flow in the dry season for Pasargadae. We studied 2 of these dams north of Pasargadae at an altitude of 2,100 meters above the sea level. We did it also because we observed a step-by-step destruction of these installations by looters, probably seeking a treasure under the enormous stone blocks. You can see some of this hole by looters here and there and here, by bulldozer. They came with a bulldozer. So the sounding we were able to carry out in 2008 and 2009 revealed in the 2 dams very sophisticated installations of ashlar masonry set into the dam, which is made of earth and stone, over about 500 meters long. This is the dam, and the stone installation at the top of that dam. These devices are so exceptional that we are still wondering how they worked out and what they were built for. The excavated one shows a very high quality of stone masonry well-drafted limestone blocks up to 2.5 meters too long, using anatherosis. That means flattening the edge of the stone in order to join the other block very perfectly, here with another one, and bonding the blocks with the so-called clamps made of an iron bar set into a hollow poured with lead. This is typically Greek, directly inspired by contemporary Iron and Greek stone technique. To date, we observe a very peculiar shape of the clamps here, dovetail-shaped, and it's typical from Cyrus and disappear after Cyrus. Under Darius, it's a different shape of clamps. So this is the first clue for the datation. The other one is some radiocarbon date pointing to the late 6th century BC and early 5th century BC. This construction is a very odd structure, Greek masonry, but the construction itself is very strange, without any comparison for the moment. This is a 20 meters long installation, opening with a large conduit more than 1 meter high, here, very big. So you can imagine the size of the blocks, stone blocks here, and continuing in a small chamber with 6 smaller channels here. Can be water gate, as it is in Pasargadae itself. This is the slot for putting the stone or the plank for closing the date. And further, this is a general view of that installation. And finishing with this. This is the beginning. Near the end. Yes. Thank you very much. So finishing in a room which was probably covered, as shown by these 3 stone pillars. So this basin is closed on border on 3 sides by big stone, and the 4th one is completely open, and there is a river bed, stream bed, continuing, going nowhere. So, yeah. So that is all what I can tell you about this very impressive construction. If there are some engineers in the audience, I would be very glad to have comments of such construction. We are still working to better understand the functioning and the aim of this important and very elaborate investment. There are other interesting examples of hydraulic investment in south of Pasargadae, in the gorge named Tangi-Boulari, by means of big canals cut into the rocks for irrigating the plain, a 9 kilometers long plain in front of the Sivan Dam, which was completed in the 2000s, and which gave the opportunity to have a series of rescue excavation by international team, an international project in this valley. But this is only a view of this canal cut into the rock, and to give you an idea, this is 10 meters high, dug into the rocks. But this is another story, and it's time to conclude. Yes. The history of Pasargadae did not stop in 530 when Cyrus died and was buried there in Pasargadae. We have no idea of his son Cambyses' activities on the site. After combines a short reign. Very likely, Darius finished some works in the palaces and erected a defensive mud brick building on the platform where Cyrus had probably planned his palace. A long and rather quiet life commenced for Pasargadae for the rest of the Achaemenid period. Alexander visited the tomb of Cyrus twice, first after conquering Persepolis in 330, and again on his way back from India in 325. Pasargadae continued afterwards for 2-3 centuries. It was again settled during the early Islamic period, but also as demonstrated by quite recent fieldwork on the site during the Sasanian period. So Cyrus was the founder and the main actor in Pasargadae, and surprisingly, he built almost every building on the site within only 2 decades. Even more striking, while he was rarely present in Pasargadae, he conceived the layout of his residence and the other components, summoning engineers, craftsmen from varied regions for implementing the technology brought from their homelands. Cyrus consciously borrowed architectural forms and iconography from these areas. From that, he added the ideas of his own and of his Persian noblemen. This Persian trait, combined with the external contribution, created the famous positive eclecticism, the completely original Achaemenid architecture. Thank you very much.